Good morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are. I'm Paul Clark and welcome to my studio. Now today we're going to be painting this lovely little peacock, and this is taken from our 3-day workshop at the powder mills. More of that in a second. Now before we start, I'd just like to give a little shout out to Leisure Painter magazine. I was really chuffed to be asked to do an article, a very first in the magazine. Some of you may even recognise this. So it's been really nicely laid out. It's got a step-by-step tutorial from me, and I'd just like to thank Ingrid, the editor, for making the process so smooth and easy. So let's get going, shall we? So we had a really marvellous 3-day painting and drawing break in and around the grounds of the Powder Mills Hotel in East Sussex. There's no doubt we'll definitely be doing it again. The weather was just amazing. There were so many lovely things to paint, including these two, Charles and Diana. So we had an afternoon in the studio, and here are some of the fantastic results from everyone. Today's materials: my paper is some Arches 140-pound cold press. Now it's in a block form, so I don't need to stretch it. If you are using 140 pound, it'd probably be a good idea to stretch it, as we're using a lot of water today. My colours are cerulean blue, phthalo green, now you could use some viridian if you haven't got that, Prussian blue, PAYNE'S grey, cadmium yellow and cadmium orange. 4 brushes, my number 6 and number 12 round, 3/4 inch flat, and there's my trusty number 3 rigger. So here is the reference drawing. And it's important that you get the shape of the head right. So a drawing template is available if you want it, free of charge to download from my website. Off we go. I'm starting with the background, and using my flat brush I'm just randomly splashing in lots of clean water. Then straight away I'm chucking in some phthalo green. Now you can use any colours you want here, but I'm just getting in lots of wet paint, including some cadmium orange and Prussian blue. So down here I'm just using some cadmium yellow, some phthalo green and some touches of cadmium orange. And I'm just letting the paint do its thing, trying to use minimum strokes and not fiddling and fussing, which will only muddy up your colours. Next I'm splatting in some Prussian blue and phthalo green. Now I know that splatting can be overused, but sometimes it's just a good way of getting colour into the mix without disturbing the paint with your brush. Here is some table salt, and try and get it into a few granules into selected areas rather than great clumps of it everywhere. Now with some Prussian blue, this is his crown, I believe, and this is still going in wet and wet. And then with the end of my brush, I'm just scraping out these little connecting lines. This is some Payne's grey and then mixed in with a little cadmium orange. Next, with some Prussian blue, I'm painting in the eyes of the feathers. Now this has had a chance to dry, I'm just brushing off any of the residue salt. Okay, so the reason why I'm re-wetting the entire body here is because I want to paint it all in one go, and I want to be sure that the paint doesn't dry to achieve all the lovely wet and wet effects. So I'm starting with my number 12 brush and some cerulean blue, leaving out the white sections on his face. Now straight in wet with some of this phthalo green, or viridian, which is a very similar colour. Now it's a colour I very rarely use and would never use it in landscapes, but to give this impression of his iridescent neck, it's perfect. Now I'm painting in a very creamy mix of Prussian blue. And here I'm really dropping in a very dark Prussian blue to get the shadow side. And here with my number 6 brush for some of the finer strokes. Here I'm just softening the edge with some clean water, just so the transition from the body to the feathers is a little more blended. And then softening a few other edges. And still with the Prussian blue, some details on his crown or crest or whatever it's called. A little watery cadmium yellow here on his face. And then just blending again with some clean water to avoid those unnatural crisp edges. Now on his beak, this is some very watery Payne's grey. But then I'm thickening the mixture for some details on his eye and his beak. it's very important here that you leave those little white dots for the sparkle in his eye. So now it's time to let this totally dry. So it's a perfect time for a short break and a glass of, would you believe it, Peacock apple cider.
Oh, that's nice.
Next I'm using my spray and wetting all the tail feather areas with clean water, as I really want to create a very soft, blurry, even sort of semi-abstract effect. Here I'm using some phthalo green again and dropping in some Prussian blue. And spraying again, as I really don't want this area to be too defined. Some cadmium yellow here, nice and loose, quick, as minimum brush strokes as possible. And back in with the phthalo green again. So now's my chance to tell you a few factoids about the peacock. In fact, he's really called the peafowl, with the peahen being the female and of course the peacock being the male. Now they're mainly native to India and are rightly famous for their beautiful plumage. They do have the most extraordinary cry. Now we have a pair of them that live up the top of our lane, and when we first moved here we thought that some poor old soul was being strangled each night. So have a listen. Anyway, I'm continuing to keep the paper surface fairly damp, so I'm constantly spraying droplets of clean water. Now with my trusty No.3 Rigger for a few finer details, and then mixing in some Prussian blue. And as you can see, I'm holding my brush near the end to get these lovely quick fluid strokes. Here I'm just adding in a little cadmium orange and some Payne's grey. And still applying spray to keep that paint moving. Next I'm just using some opaque gouache and just splatting in a little paint. So in this area around his beak, I've painted in some clean water and then dropped in some phthalo green to get more contrast between the background and the light value of his beak. I've also re-wetted this top area here and painted in wet a few of the feather colours, just to make it a little more obvious that his long tail feathers disappear off the top of the paper. Final touches now, and with a gold coloured pastel pencil I'm just putting in these few details on his crown, crest, whatever. Now for my favourite, blending with a damp tissue technique, and I'm simply softening and dragging some of these hard edges. And I think we're just about done. And it's really the result I was looking for, especially in his feathers, nice and loose and impressionistic, with the main focus being on his head. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, and you'll give it a go. Now, coming up now are some paintings picked at random from our Facebook group from one of Margot's challenges, which was painting a peacock. So please have a look. So just before we go, I would just like to thank everyone for supporting this channel as you have. Those of you who've left comments, I read everyone. Press the like button, subscribe. It really does make a difference. So thank you to everybody. So as ever, I'll look forward to seeing you all again next week for another Watercolour Wednesday. Take care, everyone. Cheers.